That's how we all die.
Someone asked me what the big deal is with Depp versus Heard court case and why it's so globally popular and why so many people tuned in to watch the court case. And even what my interest was in watching the court case. And so in a matter of like a minute, I tried to condense it all down, but this is way involved and you can't condense it down into a short sentence. But along the ways, I was listening to different podcasts and I came across this podcast, which is Claire Best, telling us how involved and in-depth this really is, and that Amber Heard may not be who you think she is. Now, some of these connections are actually news to me. So whilst Claire is describing her research and what she uncovered, I have done my own research to verify what she's saying is actually true. I don't want to credit the person who interviewed her on their channel because I don't want you to be distracted by who it was. I just want you to listen to what she said and pay attention to the verifications that I've put on the screen to show you that what she's saying is actually true. If at all you can put any weight in all of these connections, then it was actually Johnny Depp who spoke truth to power, not the other way around. Anyway, let's listen to Claire and I will try to verify everything that she's saying while she's saying it.
So Sam Bankman-Fried, who founded FTX, is the son of a Stanford feminist law professor called Barbara Fried, who works in the same Stanford law department as Michelle Dauber, who Amber Heard credited for the Me Too movement. And in 2017, Barbara Fried, who has been a very big giver to the Democratic Party, and I say this because I come off sounding like I'm a Republican. I'm actually independent, but I'm afraid, unfortunately, this does go into Democratic Party fundraising. In any event, so in 2017, Barbara Fried, Sam Bankman-Fried's mother, wrote an article that was about why everyone should be feminists. And then shortly after that, Michelle Dauber said publicly or stated publicly in an article that sexual assault was going to be on the ballot for the midterm elections, the 2018 elections. And Michelle Dauber founded this nonprofit called Enough Voter Movement, which was specifically to target primarily male Republicans, but I think there were some male Democrats as well, to accuse them of sexual assault, rightly or wrongly, and to use that and the media behind that to basically oust those candidates to get in female Democrat candidates. And they were originally going after somebody in Tennessee, I believe, but I have come across other people who believe that they have been targeted by this strategy. One of those is Justin Fairfax in Virginia, who was running for governor or assistant governor. And he actually reached out to me. He and I have been in contact. And, he discovered all of these links back to Michelle Dauber as well. And then I've also been in contact with some of the people who had been supporters of Andrew Cuomo in New York, who got targeted by Me Too. And as I say, I don't really know the ins and outs, and I'm neither for nor against Andrew Cuomo, but I did detect that there was kind of an organized strategy of a Me Too to go after him. And in fact, one of his accusers who went after him is a woman called Charlotte, I think her name is Charlotte Barrett. And she actually had a previous identity as Sally Smith, which is a nondescript anonymous name, sat in a John Doe versus Hamilton College case where John Doe was a student who was wrongly accused of sexual assault, and she was the false accuser. She is Charlotte Barrett, who was one of the accusers of Andrew Cuomo. So this just shows you kind of how wide-ranging this use of these, fake sexual assault narrative against these men have been. And it did become a game. And I'm not sure if I think it was in 2020 when Alex Morse, who was a 30-ish something Democrat candidate in Massachusetts, was running, The Intercept found out that he had been targeted in a Me Too, and that senior officials in the Democratic Party had encouraged students to accuse him of sexual assault. So it is a game. And as a woman, I find that very upsetting, because I think that sexual assault is a very serious issue. And I, have long been what I call a traditional feminist. And yes, I totally agree. There are aspects of the patriarchy and so forth that are wrong, but I will not stand up and support false accusations that ruin people's lives. They ruin their mothers, their sisters, their families, their girlfriends, their children's lives, and worse than that, they're raising money off it and they're getting votes for it. So going back to how does FTX play into all of this, and into Stanford Law, Michelle Dauber, and there's one other professor there called Pamela Karlan, who is another feminist professor. Somebody said those aren't feminists, they're extremists. I agree with you, and I think we need to make a distinction between feminism and extremism, because I think, I don't like to use statistics, but I would hazard the guess that I think the vast majority of the population in the world would stand up for feminism, but not for extremism. So anyway, so Michelle Dauber started this Enough Voter movement. And around the same time, Sam Bankman-Fried started Alameda Research. So this is, I believe, I might get the dates mixed up a little bit, but I believe it's fall 2017 that he started Alameda Research. And then a little bit later, in 2018, his mother, Barbara Fried, the Stanford Law professor, she started another nonprofit called Mind the Gap with a guy called Paul Brest and another guy called Graham Gottlieb. And they were all out of Stanford. And Graham Gottlieb had been a junior staffer in Obama's 2012 election campaign. And remind me to go back to that because it ties into Amber Heard. So they started this thing called Mind the Gap out of Stanford that was registered to Sam Bankman-Fried's parents' house on the campus at Stanford, and where he is allegedly now. And the Mind the Gap was a non-profit that was supposed to guide big donors for the Democratic Party to specific campaigns. So campaigns that they saw that were close across the nation, they would funnel money towards that, or to super PACs or whatever. And there's a crazy list of donors on it, which you can find on Influence Watch, which there are two sites I want to bring up here for anybody who wants to look further. One is called Influence Watch, and you can look up anybody's name, newspaper, anything. You find out extraordinary information, really fantastic. And the other one, or two other ones, are called Open Corporates, where you can look up people's business filings and whether they're in good standing, who they opened them with or not. And the third one is ProPublica, where you can look up nonprofits and their tax returns and see who's on the board and who's getting what. And I will say that an awful lot of my research came from these three sites of just digging around. It's public information, but not a lot of people use them. Anyway, moving on. So Mind the Gap then started up in 2018. And this guy, Graham Gottlieb, who was one of the guys who started it, who came out of Obama's 2012 campaign, he had been a fellow researcher at Stanford. And he had been in this department, I think it's like the mind brain science department or something like that. I might have got it wrong. And his bio on the Stanford site has actually been taken down now, but there's a little bit of it that is left, which essentially shows that what he was researching was how mind-brain science would integrate with federal policies and so forth. So he's registered on Mind the Gap, and then Mind the Gap at the time, and he particularly talked about gaming the system. That's what they said, gaming the system. They were gaming the system to win elections with this Mind the Gap and telling people where to put their money, put it into this race, that race, wherever else. So then Mind the Gap started in 2018. Then Mind the Gap research started in I think it was April 2019, registered to this guy, Graham Gottlieb, at Sam Bankman-Fried's parents' house on Stanford campus. And then in a little bit later in 2019, FTX started up. And I think it was fall 2019 that FTX US started up. In fact, there is an FTX EU, which nobody's really talked about, and I think is very curious. This started in Cyprus in 2014, and that is registered to Sam Bankman-Fried as well as another company in Cyprus that opened in 2016 called Innovatia, and nobody's really talked about those or what they were doing, but that's another subject. In any event, so Sam Bankman-Fried starts up FTX later in 2019. And around that time, in November 2019, Obama, who I voted for, was a very big fan of, he publicly stated that the Democrats needed to step in and stop Bernie Sanders from winning. And I don't know if that's related or not to what happened next, but I think the timing's very curious, because the next thing that happens is in the third week of March 2020, Sam Bankman-Fried opens up FTX offices under the name of West Realm Shires in several states around the United States, which look at first glance like they're strategic places for winning elections. And 3 weeks later, on the 8th of April 2020, Joe Biden is announced as the presumptive nominee. Now, between when Sam Bankman-Fried opened these offices around the United States in the third week of March 2020 and that 8th of April 2020, what happens but Tara Reade accuses Joe Biden of sexual assault. In fact, specifically of digital penetration, and in broad daylight when she was a 23 or 24-year-old intern working for or junior staffer working for him, and he was a Senate on Capitol Hill. And she was broadly kind of dismissed by the entire Democratic establishment. The New York Times admitted later that they took 3 weeks to comment on it, that they had revised their articles to make Joe Biden look more favorable. It later came out that SKDK, which is the Democratic Party PR firm, who also represent L'Oreal, for whom Amber Heard is an ambassador, that they had spent, I think, something like $2 million to discredit Tara Reade. And what was interesting about that is that Michelle Dauber came out onto Twitter and said, begging the Democratic DNC to get Joe Biden to step down, not to run, because and in fact, in one tweet, she said, "We don't want Watergate 2. And I always thought we don't want Watergate 2 meant that she didn't want the whole fakeness of the whole Me Too movement to unravel. But now I'm looking at it with this whole FTX thing, thinking, wait a minute, not only were you using feminism and sexual assault for fundraising and votes for the Democratic Party elections, But now a law professor in your same department who is with Mind the Gap, who is supposedly advising her son with FTX as to where they should put their money, is also involved, and it becomes a whole crypto scam.
Wow.
So, and on top of that, last time we spoke, I mentioned that there was allegedly an FBI investigation going on in Santa Clara County that involved Michelle Dauber, called Operation Mystery Dinner. Well, on the blog site Jane and John Q, which has a lot about Michelle Dauber, it's alleged on that Michelle Dauber was and the local attorneys and elected officials in Santa Clara County, which is where Stanford is, were involved in their own crypto scam. Whether it's the same one, I don't know, but they were, according to this.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's huge. It's absolutely huge.
Yeah.
So the other element that ties into this, that I purely came across by accident as I was digging around on open corporates, was I looked up Michelle Dauber, and lo and behold, Michelle Dauber started a non-profit at her own home address in Palo Alto, near Stanford, in 2008 with Davida Brooke. And who is Davida Brooke? Well, she was Amber Heard's attorney until during the Sun trial, and then until it became evident that the ACLU had created the Washington Post Me Too op-ed. And when it became known that the Washington Post Me Too op-ed had been created for Amber Heard by the ACLU, Amber Heard's legal team quit abruptly without any explanation, and the people who quit included Davida Brooke, Roberta Kaplan, Davida Brooke, and a couple of others. And nobody really kind of pursued that thread, but I'm now of the opinion that Washington Post op-ed literally directly had Michelle Dauber's involvement in it, in creating it. And the reason I say that is because there's a paragraph in it that talks about Title IX and sexual assault on campus. And Michelle Dauber was the co-creator, co-author of the unregulated 2011 Dear Colleague letter that was launched in New Hampshire by Joe Biden and led to all this campus kangaroo courts and this disciplinary procedure, which ultimately, backfired and led to things like Katie Meyer's death.
Right.
And the crypto thing goes back to then as well, because the other thing I discovered was that, in 2009, the Department of Justice started funding the University of New Hampshire, where the Dear Colleague letter was introduced, started funding the University of New Hampshire Prevention Innovation Research Center with $900,000 and then several more $1 million after that for two things. And one was called Know Your Power, which has now been trademarked, but seems to copy the name of a book by Nancy Pelosi that was published in 2008. And bystander, or bringing in the bystander training, which is supposed to prevent sexual assault on campus. And Know Your Power and bystander training went on to get more funding from the Department of Justice, were introduced in schools and colleges around the states, around the nation and across the world. And then in 2018, they went under the umbrella of a thing called Soteria Solutions. And Soteria Solutions is based out of the University of New Hampshire. It is a for-profit enterprise. It was recognized by the White House for entrepreneurship using federal funds. And it coincidentally shares the exact same logo as Soteria Finance Holdings in London. Different color. Soteria Solutions is like a turquoise green color, and Soteria Finance Holdings in London is orange, but the logo is the exact same. So I looked up on Open Corporate Soteria Finance Holdings, and I looked into its corporate papers, And Soteria Finance Holdings deals in Binance and Bitcoin. And it is owned by another company in Luxembourg that is owned by somebody called Steven Schwartzman in New York, who is BlackRock. And Sam Bankman-Fried has been tied to BlackRock. So I would like to know if our public funds have gone to the University of New Hampshire via the Department of Justice to fund a very faulty, very gender-biased investigative procedure that's being sold around the country, around the world, under Soteria. And if, in fact, it is a for-profit enterprise that ends up in Bitcoin and Binance, and if it's tied to FTX, as I say, I can't say that it is. I just find it very curious that Soteria is an unusual name anyway. And now in London, in UK, they've introduced Operation Soteria, which is supposed to increase the successful prosecutions of sex offences. And it's like, I'm not interested in increasing or decreasing the prosecution of sex offences. What I'd like to see is a fair and just process, a due process, where everybody's treated equally, where the facts speak for themselves, where they're not manipulated with the help of media, social media, algorithms, whether somebody's got the money or not, and that everybody gets a fair play. But what we're seeing is that, justice more than ever is not fair, and justice more than ever is being manipulated by the use of social media, by paid partnerships, by Twitter, and it has a center at Stanford where it's all altered, and this disgusting fusion between the Department of Justice and our education systems. Mm-hmm. And there's a third feminist professor at Stanford Law that I want to mention in all of this, and her name is Pamela Karlan, K-R-A-L-A-N, who describes herself somewhere as a whiny Jewish lesbian, or words similar. She came out of the Obama Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights, and she is at Stanford Law School, and she's a feminist professor. And she recently, she took a leave of absence from Stanford, they announced it, to go and work in the Department of Justice again, until a few months ago when the New York Post announced that she'd quietly stepped down from the US Department of Justice because financial disclosures showed that the Department of Justice was paying Stanford for her Department of Justice salary while she was, which was $180,000 or something like that, while she was simultaneously getting well over $1 million, I think it might have been as much as 1.9 million from Stanford. So the Department of Justice were paying Stanford for her to be at the Department of Justice, and she was sitting as a feminist professor coming out of the Office of Civil Rights at Stanford. And I looked up her bio, Michelle Dauber's bio, and Barbara Fried's bio, and their lectures that they give, their courses on the Stanford Law School site. And it is quite shocking because some of them are literally just meetings, and they're about feminism and the elections and so on and so forth. So it's a real pickle that is quite disgusting, and I think deserves a lot more scrutiny from the public. And Stanford, I think, is burying its head in the sand. Stanford right now is facing all sorts of ethical complaints. The Stanford Daily even admitted that they made a false statement about one of their professors who's just had to cough up, or been told to cough up 29 million for scientific discoveries that were false. The Stanford is facing a official Title IX complaint for sex discrimination, gender bias, and And then just yesterday or the day before, Stanford's Title IX department was issued a formal request for an investigation into Michelle Dauber specifically, and actually quoting some of the things that she had done regarding Amber Heard, and using social media, her criticisms of Camille Vasquez, and generally an ethics complaint against her. So that's what's going on. It's a big subject, and I think that it's a subject that everybody should be paying attention to. It is our money. Our money has been misused and abused, and I wanted to circle back to Graham Gottlieb and the Obama 2012 election, because thank you very much for, it's insane all this going on behind the scenes, Bravo. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And as I say, I never intended to go down this rabbit hole. It's not my primary job. My primary job is a film and television agent. But, I was dealing with gender discrimination in my industry, protecting my clients who'd either been falsely accused or who had been sexually assaulted. And it was just one of those things where I thought, I have to find out what's going on. This is affecting all of us. It's very, very serious. The whole 99% thing, it is the rest of us voters. And, you find out that basically we're being manipulated so much by FTX, by these donations, by Mind the Gap, by Michelle Dauber, by the Enough Voter movement, by their partnerships with political PR companies. So in line with political PR companies, Amber Heard had a political PR company called Precision Strategies until the end of the first week of the Virginia trial, when they split company. And I looked into Precision Strategies. Precision Strategies was founded by a woman called Stephanie Cutter, who coincidentally was Obama's PR strategist for the 2012 election campaign, like Graham Gottlieb, who founded Mind the Gap. And Precision Strategies also happens to represent the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. And Stephanie Cutter, in her bio, talks specifically about her relations with the Washington Post, with Rolling Stone, with Politico magazine, and a few others, but those three particularly, which are all ones that have essentially been very much aligned with the Amber Heard narrative. So, I had long maintained that Amber Heard was an asset, if you like, a political tool for the Democratic Party. Amber Heard has been a spokesperson, I believe, for UN Women as well, who as well as L'Oreal, are also represented by SKDK. And SKDK is a political PR company that also represents Pfizer. It represents the government of Ukraine. It represents Prince Albert of Monaco. It represents AT&T. It represents Disney, which owns ABC. It represents a non-profit called It's On Us, which is about campus rape. It did represent Time's Up and the National Women's Legal Center until it came out that they had worked against the accusations of against Andrew Cuomo, and they admitted that there was a conflict of interest. And they represent a non-profit called Vital Voices, which was founded by Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton in 1997 with money from the Clinton Foundation. And the Clinton Foundation was founded in part by Jeffrey Epstein. So, and Jeffrey Epstein's survivors have actually been pushing for discovery on the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Foundation for how their money has spent. And then, as some people may have seen in the last few days, the Attorney General of the US Virgin Islands sued the bank JP Morgan, accusing JP Morgan of essentially being complicit in Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex trafficking. And 4 days after she filed this suit, she got fired by the governor of the US Virgin Islands. And who happened to be in the US Virgin Islands at this time? Joe Biden and apparently Bill Gates. And Bill Gates had called Jeffrey Epstein his financial guru. So as I say, who really knows what's at the bottom of all of this? But it's dark and it's dirty, and things keep getting taken off the table, taken out of public view. And I think it's really disturbing. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at open corporates, which, by the way, I suggest everybody does. Go to open corporates, look up Sam Bankman-Fried, look at the number of companies that he is involved in. It is staggering. And you think that Sam Bankman-Fried had 4 meetings with the White House. He had his company was given a trading and brokering account, pass or license, and he was meeting with Gary Gensler at the SEC. He and his father, who's a tax attorney professor at Stanford, we're talking to. These are all the companies that are interrelated. But the reason that I find that very curious is I'm a lay person. I'm not a finance person, and I don't have a degree in economics. I can look at that, and I can look at the dates of all of those opening, and I can look at the funding that went into the election campaigns and say, isn't there something fishy here? So why is it that Gary Gensler at the SEC, that the White House, that Steve Ricchetti, who is Biden's, I think, campaign finance guy, that they can just take, $5 million here, a few $1 million here, 20, and they don't, not one of them looks into this and say, hang on a minute, isn't this a little weird that this guy opened all these companies, around the same time? Like, where's the money coming from? And nobody's really answered. I mean, the Alameda, which is what he started originally, they did talk about, investors in that money into that fund, but it's an awful lot of money. And, and FTX was officially partnered with Ukraine, which, if you remember, has SKDK as its PR company. And it was officially partnered with the World Economic Forum. And both the World Economic Forum and Ukraine have tried to distance themselves from being involved with FTX. But you have to ask, how is it that this upstart with parents at Stanford Law School and, with Stanford's involvement with Google, with Twitter, with Pfizer, and with the Democratic Party fundraising, how did it get this far? And you can guarantee, in fact, you can even see it in the New York Times articles, that they're trying to kind of downplay it, and they're feeling sorry for his parents and so forth. And I'm sorry, I don't feel sorry for his parents. You don't buy a $16 million house in the Bahamas if you're a tax attorney and a law professor and claim that actually it was, even though it says it's a holiday home on the listing, that it was meant to be part of the company. I think that they're all covering this up, and I feel really aggrieved by this, because you have these students around the country at Stanford, everywhere, who have nothing like the privileges of these people, who are basically preaching to the rest of us their, woke ideology for, effective altruism, earning a lot of money and giving it all away. And it's like, you look into it, and what are they doing? They're giving it to their friends. They're pretending that they care about diversity, equity, inclusion, feminism, blah, blah, blah. It's all rubbish. It's all a front. And I find it really upsetting and dismissive of the public and the public's interests and our children. And so why am I here fighting all of this? Because I feel like it's our children's futures. And if we're not going to leave our children with a more ethical, better world, what are we doing? Tom Girardi, who is, a prominent attorney and, prominent fundraiser or contributor to the Democratic Party, he's just been found guilty of, spending clients' money on all sorts of stuff. And it's like, he gets a special thank you on the Hunting Ground documentary, which also was financed out by Democratic donors out of Stanford. And or Gloria Allred, another one. She's an ambulance chaser. Allegedly, she's being investigated by the FBI as well. And it's like, if somebody said yesterday, what's the difference between an activist and a propagandist? And my answer to that is, an activist is someone who is passionate about what they believe in, but will answer questions with reasoning behind what they believe. A propagandist is someone who sings the song, but who can't answer questions rationally and then just shuts you down. Michelle Dauber is a propagandist. She doesn't answer questions. She runs away. She spouts all sorts of, venomous, hateful things on the internet. She's racist. And I think she's a misogynist as well as a misandrist. And I think we have to really take people like that on head on and call them out. And it's Michelle Dauber is a kingpin, but there are other kingpins or queen pins. there are other people out there, and they're surrounded by this network of these activist journalists like Kat Tenenbaum, like Taylor Lorenz, like Susan Zalkind. That you can literally pull them out, and there's a whole list of these so-called activist feminist journalists. They're not activist feminist journalists at all. They're propagandist feminist journalists, and they're tied into this network with these political PR companies, coming up with these narratives for Amber Heard and so forth. And as I say, I'm no fan of Amber Heard, and I think, but as I said last time, we need to separate out what happened with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp in their marriage versus how she became a political tool afterwards. And the ACLU said in 2016, in summer 2016, in fact, that she had given her $3.5 million of the $7 million divorce settlement to the ACLU. The ACLU stated that. They knew that she hadn't. So the ACLU lied. The head of the ACLU, Anthony D. Romero, also comes out of Stanford Law School.
Wow.
Yeah. And so they lied. Then she appears in November 2016 with Michelle Dauber to get the Women of the Year award that is given to Michelle Dauber, who's collecting it for Emily Doe, aka Chanel Miller, for after the Emily Doe Victim Impact Statement, which it appears that Michelle Dauber wrote herself. And then in the trial of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard in Virginia, the ACLU said at one point, or the representative of the ACLU said at one point that they had got Amber Heard because they'd heard her speak so eloquently about women's issues and for UN women and things like that. And I'm thinking, like, yeah, she doesn't write that stuff. It's created for her. She's an actor. She's speaking it. And yeah, is this
she
really
knows how to deliver?
Yeah, and is this really Michelle Dauber behind it all? And I believe that due process, if we were ever allowed to have it, would reveal that Michelle Dauber is behind a ton of this. One thing that I noticed is that when I looked into this non-profit called Building a Better Legal Profession that Michelle Dauber founded with Davida Brooke, who became Amber Heard's attorney. But what was interesting is the open corporate site looks like the company dissolved in June 2015, which was around the time that Michelle Dauber and her husband, Ken Dauber, were being probed for a too close relationship with the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. But then on December the 1st, 2018, there's an entry with Michelle Dauber coming in again. And so I want to know if that has anything to do with the lead up to the December 18th, 2018 Washington Post op-ed. I think it's very curious. And the same thing with your insurance you claim. I think the timing and the orchestration of this is all very strange. The Glamour, yeah. Well, and the Glamour magazine article came out, I think it came out in the fall of 2018 when Amber Heard, said that I'm nobody's victim, Amber Heard, and then she credits Michelle Dauber in the article for the Me Too movement. And she says that she is just amplifying Michelle Dauber's voice. The people behind Amber Heard, Roberta Kaplan, David Brooke, the Gloria Allreds of the world and so forth, who have basically taken sexual assault, turned it into a political thing, used an actor or a recruited person to push this narrative, and then tried to kind of shirk behind in the shadows. And I guarantee you, I just don't think that Amber Heard is smart enough to have decided to take out that kind of insurance claim by herself. I mean, let's say, I'm not saying she's not smart, but I just don't, I don't think it's something that I would have done necessarily. So why was she doing it? Now, there are very good reasons why she would do it. And that is in 2018, starting earlier in the year, Amber Heard became very politically active for the Me Too movement. She was the VIP guest at Vital Voices. She went to the Women's March thing. She spoke for UN Women. She was, and then in the whole correspondence leading up to the publication of the Washington Post op-ed, there was a discussion in the emails about the risks of her being sued for defamation. And if you recall, at one point, the ACLU wanted to enter into the lawsuit that Johnny Depp had against her with her, which is peculiar. So the ACLU, frankly, I think should be put up there on every media channel and questioned about exactly what was going on. And Anthony D. Romero tried to avoid deposition, and he didn't want to reveal ACLU's business relationships with their other things. Well, I can tell you that all those non-profits and victims' rights advocacy groups that signed that Amicus brief a few months ago, that Michelle Dauber's signature were on, they're all one and the same. They're all one and the same. And I think that it is absolutely preposterous that the IRS and the Department of Justice hasn't cracked down on them all and sued them all and demanded fines and demanded accountability and prosecutions for what's been going on, because they're all tied up together. Many of those non-profits that signed that amicus brief also signed another amicus brief to the Connecticut Supreme Court in a case called Saifullah Khan, Khan versus Yale University, because Saifullah Khan was wrongly accused of sexual assault. It went to a criminal trial. He was acquitted on everything. He turned around, he sued Yale for $110 million, and he sued the false accuser, and he maintained that the false accuser had been set up to do it, just like Amber Heard.
Oh my
and
God.
these And these non-profits stepped in and wrote an amicus brief, basically in support of this girl, and saying essentially that false accusations should be fine, and that it would be set a horrible precedent if they weren't. And so thank God the Connecticut Supreme Court rejected their amicus brief first time round, because in their amicus brief they said Saifullah Khan raped Jane Doe, the girl. And since he'd been acquitted of rape, but the Connecticut Supreme Court rejected it and said they could resubmit their amicus brief shorn of all facts that hadn't been proven as material fact, i.e. they had to remove the fact that they couldn't say, Saifullah Khan raped Jane Doe. So they did resubmit, and the oral arguments have been heard, and I don't think a decision has been made yet. But it was there's a professor in Brooklyn called Casey Johnson, who's been magnificent at following these false accusations and Title IX cases in college campuses. And Casey Johnson commented that in the oral arguments, or maybe the written arguments in this case, that it was really peculiar that Yale seemed to kind of not distinguish itself from this girl and sided up together. So in other words, instead of it being the false accuser, Yale in the middle, and the Connecticut court system and Saifullah Khan, either four parties, that in their arguments it appeared that Yale and the false accuser were aligned together. So here you have Yale supporting a false accuser. Here you have Stanford supporting false accusers. It's dangerous. And they're the same non-profits, the National Women's Legal Center, Know Your Nine, It's on Us. It's the same ones who were supporting Amber Heard's, and her amicus brief. And I think that every single one of these should be scrutinized, and they're also all earning gobloads of money. You look on ProPublica and you look at their IRS Form 990 returns, and you see the line items. They're earning a lot of money. The ACLU guy, I think he's earning over $1 million now, and then the next person below him does like 12 hours a week and gets $300 and something thousand. I mean, so you can't sit here and tell me that the ACLU cares about rights or that they care about diversity, equity, inclusion when they're all cleaning up like kings. Their non-profits aren't paying taxes because they're non-profits, and unlike the rest of us and our companies who are paying our taxes, paying our corporate taxes, it is absolutely disgusting. I went on the RAINN network yesterday. That's the Rape and Incest National Network, I think it's called, which is the largest lobby group for sexual assault and survivors. Mm-hmm. And it is commonly quoted in mainstream media and by workplaces and colleges and universities as being the kind of definitive resource. But I encourage everybody to look at the fine print on there, and you will find that it has a disclaimer at the bottom, which basically says that the Department of Justice and so forth doesn't endorse a single thing on it. Not a single thing, nothing. But then you go into other areas of it, and one of the first things you come to is how to interview a survivor. Does this story work for you? And it's essentially encouraging people to, it's encouraging survivor status, and it's encouraging journalists to go and find survivor stories and to tell these stories. And it's like, it's not that I'm not interested in survivor stories. I'm interested in this, in the truth. And every false survivor story there is harms someone with a real survivor story. Yes. And I think that's a very serious issue. We are harming feminism with what we're doing. We are harming women's credibility. I personally, my mother, my grandmother, fought for years, for centuries, to get a place at the table. we found a place at the table by being honest, by being truthful, by owning what we did wrong, and I'm just not going to buy into, and I don't want my daughters to, and I don't want anyone to buy into this, believe all women, empowering, It's like, is that, I hated her at the time, but is that what Maggie Thatcher did? Is that what Mrs. Gandhi did? Is that what, Angela Merkel did? Is that what Condoleezza Rice did? Is that, we've had really fantastic, female leaders. I mean, including Hillary Clinton. Nobody did any of this until the last decade. And then they turned it into this thing. And frankly, they've really harmed us.
Thank you. And that's how we all die.